There's a three-stage cycle that has destroyed every paper currency in history when governments start printing money to solve their problems. In 1921, Germany had 4 marks to the dollar. 2 years later, it took 4 trillion marks to buy the same dollar. In 2006, Zimbabwe printed money to pay their bills. By 2008, prices doubled every single day, and they ended up printing $100 trillion bills that couldn't buy a loaf of bread. 3 stages, every time. Stage 1, governments start printing. Stage 2, people realize their money is dying and spend it as fast as possible. Stage 3, complete currency collapse. And here's what should terrify you. Since 2020, the United States has increased the money supply by 40%, while people are just starting to spend faster, expecting prices to rise. We've completed stage 1, and we're entering stage 2 of the exact same cycle that destroyed the German mark and the Zimbabwean dollar. If you want to understand what comes next and how to protect yourself before we hit stage 3, subscribe, because most people won't see this coming until it's too late. The financial establishment wants the public to believe that hyperinflation emerges from chaos, an unpredictable economic storm that strikes without warning. This narrative serves their interests because it obscures a fundamental truth that governments and central banks desperately want hidden from public consciousness. Hyperinflation is not random. It follows a precise, predictable 3-stage cycle that has repeated throughout history whenever governments abandon fiscal discipline and embrace monetary expansion as their primary economic tool. This cycle has destroyed currencies across continents and centuries, yet the pattern remains remarkably consistent, almost as if there exists an invisible rulebook that governments follow when they choose to sacrifice their currency for short-term political survival. The first stage begins when governments face fiscal pressure and turn to money creation as their solution. During this phase, the central bank expands the money supply to fund government spending, bailout programs, or economic stimulus measures. The public remains largely unaware of the monetary expansion's true scope, and most citizens continue holding their savings in the depreciating currency. This creates an illusion of stability, even as the foundation of monetary value erodes beneath the surface. The government maintains the facade that their currency remains sound, while systematically undermining its purchasing power through deliberate debasement. Stage 2 emerges when the public begins recognizing that their currency is losing value and responds by spending money faster before it deteriorates further. This behavioral shift represents the critical turning point where psychology overwhelms monetary policy. Citizens abandon the habit of saving in favor of immediate consumption, converting their cash into goods, services, or alternative stores of value. The velocity of money accelerates dramatically as people rush to escape the depreciating currency, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where rising prices fuel faster spending, which generates even higher prices. The third and final stage arrives when panic overtakes rational economic behavior and the currency experiences complete collapse. Citizens abandon the dying currency entirely, seeking refuge in foreign money, precious metals, barter systems, or any alternative that maintains value better than the government's paper. At this point, the currency has lost its fundamental functions as a medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account. Economic chaos ensues as the entire monetary system disintegrates, taking with it the savings, pensions, and financial security of ordinary citizens, while the political and financial elites who orchestrated the crisis often escape with their wealth intact. The mathematical relationship governing this destruction operates through the equation of exchange, expressed as money supply multiplied by velocity equals price level multiplied by real output. When governments increase the money supply while real economic output remains static or declines, the only variables that can adjust are velocity and price levels. Initially, velocity may remain low as people continue normal spending patterns, temporarily masking the inflationary pressure. However, once velocity begins rising in stage 2, the mathematical relationship becomes explosive. A doubling of both money supply and velocity can quadruple price levels even if real output stays constant, creating the devastating exponential inflation that characterizes hyperinflationary collapse. This three-stage pattern has destroyed the German mark, the Zimbabwean dollar, and dozens of other currencies throughout history. Each collapse followed the identical sequence, yet governments continue implementing the same policies that guarantee monetary destruction. The pattern suggests that hyperinflation represents not an economic accident, but a deliberate mechanism for transferring wealth from savers to debtors, from the middle class to the government, and from the productive economy to the financial sector. Understanding this cycle becomes crucial for protecting personal wealth, because once stage 2 begins, the mathematical forces driving currency destruction become nearly impossible to reverse through conventional monetary policy. The Weimar Republic provides the most instructive example of how stage 1 unfolds, demonstrating the precise mechanics through which governments initiate the destruction of their own currency while maintaining the illusion of economic stability. Following Germany's defeat in the First World War, the Treaty of Versailles imposed crushing reparations payments that created an impossible fiscal burden for the German government. These payments, denominated in gold marks and foreign currency, demanded resources that Germany simply did not possess through normal taxation or economic activity. Faced with this external pressure and domestic political instability, the German government made the fateful decision to abandon fiscal restraint and embrace monetary expansion as their primary tool for meeting financial obligations. The Reichsbank began printing marks aggressively in 1921, initially justifying this policy as temporary stimulus needed to rebuild the war-damaged economy and meet international obligations. Government officials assured the public that the monetary expansion would remain controlled and that the mark would maintain its value once economic conditions normalized. This messaging proved deliberately deceptive, as the government had already committed to a path that made currency preservation impossible. The reparations payments alone exceeded Germany's capacity to pay through legitimate economic means, making monetary debasement the only mechanism available for generating the necessary funds. During the early phase of money printing in 1921 and early 1922, inflation remained relatively modest, and many German citizens continued conducting business as usual. The exchange rate moved from approximately 320 marks per United States dollar in mid-1922 to roughly 7,400 marks per dollar by late 1922. Yet most Germans still held their savings in marks and continued using the currency for daily transactions. This behavioral pattern illustrates the critical characteristic of stage 1. The public maintains faith in their currency, even as its purchasing power erodes, creating the conditions for catastrophic losses once reality becomes undeniable. The abandonment of any gold standard backing proved essential to enabling this monetary destruction. Previously, currencies tied to gold or other hard assets faced natural constraints on expansion, because governments could not create precious metals through printing presses. Once Germany suspended gold convertibility, the mark became purely fiat currency, whose value depended entirely on government restraint and public confidence. This liberation from physical constraints removed the final barrier preventing unlimited monetary expansion, transforming currency into a political tool rather than an economic instrument. The psychological dynamics of stage 1 reveal the sophisticated trap that ensnares ordinary citizens. Government propaganda consistently promoted the narrative that monetary expansion served national interests and economic recovery, while mainstream economists provided intellectual cover by arguing that increased money supply would stimulate growth and employment. Citizens who questioned this policy faced accusations of being unpatriotic or economically ignorant, creating social pressure to maintain confidence in the currency despite mounting evidence of its deterioration. Throughout this period, the majority of German savers continued holding marks in bank accounts, government bonds, and cash savings, believing that their government would eventually restore monetary stability. This faith proved catastrophically misplaced, as the government had already crossed the point of no return. The Stage 1 trap operates precisely because it appears manageable and temporary while actually establishing the mathematical and psychological conditions that make Stages 2 and 3 inevitable. Once governments embrace unlimited money printing to solve fiscal problems, they create addiction-like dependency, where each new crisis demands even greater monetary expansion, ultimately leading to complete currency collapse. The velocity of money represents the critical mechanism that transforms monetary expansion from a manageable policy tool into an unstoppable force of economic destruction. Velocity measures the rate at which each unit of currency circulates through the economy, calculated by dividing total economic output by the money supply in circulation. Under normal economic conditions, velocity remains relatively stable as people maintain predictable spending and saving patterns. However, when citizens begin recognizing that their currency is losing purchasing power, velocity accelerates dramatically as rational behavior shifts from saving money to spending it as quickly as possible before further value erosion occurs. The mathematical relationship governing this acceleration operates through the equation of exchange, where money supply multiplied by velocity equals price level multiplied by real economic output. During Stage 1, governments can expand the money supply substantially while velocity remains low, temporarily masking the inflationary impact. Citizens continue holding cash and conducting normal economic activities, allowing the expanded money supply to circulate at historical speeds. This creates the dangerous illusion that monetary expansion carries no consequences, encouraging governments to pursue even more aggressive money creation policies. Zimbabwe's hyperinflation during the mid-2000s demonstrates precisely how velocity transforms monetary expansion into economic catastrophe. The government of Robert Mugabe began printing money aggressively in 2006 to fund land redistribution programs, government spending, and economic subsidies after agricultural output collapsed and export revenues plummeted. Initially, the broad money supply expansion seemed manageable, as citizens continued using Zimbabwean dollars for daily transactions, and many people maintained savings in the local currency. The government assured the public that the monetary policy would stimulate economic recovery and restore prosperity. By 2007, however, ordinary Zimbabweans began recognizing that holding cash meant watching their purchasing power evaporate in real time. Inflation accelerated from double digits to triple digits as people abandoned the practice of saving money in favor of immediate consumption. Workers demanded payment more frequently. Businesses raised prices multiple times per day, and citizens rushed to convert cash into goods, foreign currency, or any asset that might retain value better than the dying Zimbabwean dollar. This behavioral shift caused velocity to surge exponentially, amplifying the inflationary impact of the expanded money supply, far beyond what government economists had predicted. The psychology driving Stage 2 creates a self-reinforcing feedback loop that becomes mathematically impossible to control through conventional monetary policy. As people observe prices rising, they respond by spending money faster to avoid losses, which increases the circulation speed of currency and drives prices even higher. This accelerated spending validates their fears about currency depreciation, encouraging even faster spending in an escalating cycle. Businesses begin adjusting prices hourly rather than monthly, Workers demand daily rather than weekly wages, and ordinary commerce transforms into a desperate race against monetary debasement. By 2008, Zimbabwe experienced daily inflation rates so extreme that prices approximately doubled every 24 hours, making long-term planning impossible and destroying the currency's fundamental function as a store of value. The mathematical forces unleashed by rising velocity in a high money supply environment created exponential rather than linear price increases, demonstrating how Stage 2 transforms manageable inflation into hyperinflationary collapse. Citizens who had maintained faith in their currency during Stage 1 found their savings completely worthless within months, illustrating the devastating speed with which velocity can destroy decades of accumulated wealth. The transition from Stage 1 to Stage 2 represents the point where monetary policy loses control over economic outcomes. Once velocity begins accelerating, central banks discover that their traditional tools become powerless against the mathematical forces they have unleashed, setting the stage for the complete currency collapse that defines Stage 3. Stage 3 represents the mathematical and psychological point, where currency collapse becomes irreversible, transforming from an economic crisis into a complete breakdown of monetary civilization. When both money supply expansion and velocity acceleration reach extremes, while real economic output simultaneously contracts, the equation of exchange produces exponential price increases that destroy the currency's ability to function as money. Citizens abandon the dying currency entirely, seeking any alternative store of value that maintains purchasing power better than the government's increasingly worthless paper. This mass rejection of the official currency creates panic that spreads throughout the entire economic system, collapsing not just prices, but the fundamental infrastructure of modern commerce. Zimbabwe's final stage demonstrates the surreal extremes to which governments will pursue monetary expansion even as their currency disintegrates. As hyperinflation accelerated beyond control in 2008, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe responded by printing ever larger denominations rather than acknowledging the futility of their monetary policy. The government issued $10 million notes, then $100 million notes, followed by $10 billion notes as each new denomination quickly became insufficient for basic transactions. This escalation culminated in January 2009 with the infamous $100 trillion note, a piece of paper that represented the complete abandonment of mathematical reality in favor of political theater. The $100 trillion note serves as the perfect symbol of Stage 3 collapse because it demonstrates how hyperinflation transforms currency from a tool of economic exchange into worthless political propaganda. Citizens could not purchase basic necessities with these astronomical denominations because merchants refused to accept them, recognizing that the currency had lost all connection to economic value. The government's printing of increasingly absurd denominations revealed their complete detachment from economic reality and their willingness to sacrifice their population's financial security rather than acknowledge the failure of their monetary policies. During Stage 3, money ceases performing its three essential functions in any meaningful way. As a medium of exchange, the currency becomes useless because merchants reject it or demand payment in alternatives like foreign currency, gold, or barter goods. As a store of value, the currency fails catastrophically as purchasing power evaporates faster than people can spend their holdings. As a unit of account, prices become meaningless because they change multiple times per day and vary dramatically between different merchants, making rational economic calculation impossible. The broader social consequences of Stage 3 extend far beyond rising prices to encompass complete institutional breakdown. Banking systems collapse as deposits become worthless and credit markets freeze entirely. Savings accounts pension funds, insurance policies, and government bonds lose all value overnight, destroying the financial security that citizens had accumulated over decades. Supply chains disintegrate as producers refuse payment in the dying currency, creating severe shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. Employment becomes problematic as wages paid in the morning lose substantial purchasing power by evening, forcing workers to demand payment in alternatives or abandon formal employment entirely. The generational wealth destruction during Stage 3 proves particularly devastating because it wipes out not just current income, but accumulated savings that represent lifetimes of productive work. Middle-class families who had carefully built retirement accounts and education funds discover that their financial planning becomes meaningless when the currency itself dies. Young people entering the workforce find that traditional career paths and savings strategies no longer function in an economy where money has lost its fundamental properties. Social trust collapses as institutions that promised financial security prove unable to honour their commitments, creating lasting damage to the social contract between citizens and their government that can persist for generations after the hyperinflation ends. The three-stage hyperinflation cycle has repeated with mathematical precision across different continents, political systems, and historical periods, revealing that currency collapse follows universal laws rather than unique circumstances. Hungary experienced the most extreme hyperinflation in recorded history during 1946, when prices doubled every 15 hours at the peak of the crisis. Argentina has endured multiple hyperinflation episodes, including the catastrophic collapse of 1989, when annual inflation exceeded 3,000%. Venezuela's recent hyperinflation began in 2014 and followed the identical sequence, progressing from money printing to velocity acceleration to complete currency abandonment. Brazil, Chile, Poland, Yugoslavia, and dozens of other nations have experienced the same pattern, demonstrating that hyperinflation represents a structural feature of fiat monetary systems rather than isolated economic accidents. Each case begins with external shock or fiscal pressure that governments attempt to solve through monetary expansion rather than structural reform. Hungary faced massive war debts and reparations after the Second World War. Argentina struggled with fiscal deficits and foreign debt obligations. Venezuela confronted collapsing oil revenues and government spending commitments, while Brazil dealt with development spending and external debt service. Despite vastly different political systems and economic conditions, each government chose the same solution: printing money to bridge the gap between obligations and resources. This consistent policy choice reveals that hyperinflation emerges not from economic ignorance, but from political calculation that prioritizes short-term survival over long-term monetary stability. The underlying structural mechanism enabling these repeated collapses stems from the fundamental characteristics of fiat currency systems that lack any stable backing or restraint mechanism. When currencies were tied to gold or other hard assets, governments faced natural limits on money creation because they could not manufacture precious metals through political decree. The abandonment of gold standards during the 20th century removed these constraints, transforming currency into pure government debt, backed only by political promises and public confidence. This transformation created conditions where monetary expansion became the path of least resistance for governments facing fiscal challenges, regardless of the long-term consequences for their populations. The mathematical relationship governing fiat currency destruction operates independently of political intentions or economic theories because it reflects fundamental laws of human behavior and market dynamics. Once governments begin expanding money supply to solve problems, they create dependency on continued expansion because stopping the policy would force acknowledgement of underlying fiscal reality. Each crisis demands greater monetary expansion than the previous intervention, creating an escalating cycle that ultimately leads to complete currency collapse. The equation of exchange ensures that persistent money supply growth, combined with rising velocity, will produce exponential price increases that destroy the currency's economic function. The pattern suggests that hyperinflation serves specific interests within the financial and political establishment, functioning as a wealth transfer mechanism that benefits debtors at the expense of savers and creditors. Governments can erase their debt obligations through currency debasement, while maintaining the fiction that they have honoured their commitments by paying in nominal terms. Financial institutions that understand the cycle can position themselves to profit from currency collapse, while ordinary citizens who trust official assurances lose their accumulated wealth. This systematic redistribution occurs with such regularity across different countries and time periods that it appears designed rather than accidental. The repetitive nature of the three-stage cycle indicates that governments and central banks either refuse to learn from historical examples or deliberately choose policies that guarantee monetary destruction, because the short-term political benefits outweigh the long-term economic costs. Either explanation reveals that citizens cannot rely on their monetary authorities to preserve currency value when facing fiscal pressure, making personal preparation an alternative wealth. Preservation strategies essential for financial survival during the inevitable transition from fiat currency dominance to monetary reality.